Seaman First Class Tyrone Jenkins pulled the blood-soaked life jacket from the water off Utah Beach. Fresh bullet holes through the canvas, dog tags still attached. The name stamped in metal read like a death sentence for someone who would never make it home. Waves crashed against the landing craft ramp behind him, then machine gun fire erupted from the cliffs above. German positions, they were told, had been cleared 3 hours ago. The rounds walked across the water toward his boat. June 6, 1944 marked the largest amphibious invasion in human history, with over 150,000 Allied troops crossing the English Channel to storm 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. While newsreels would later show white infantry charging through surf under fire, they rarely captured the black naval crews who operated the most dangerous vessels in the invasion fleet, the landing ship tanks and landing craft vehicles that made repeated trips into killing zones, delivering troops, vehicles, ammunition and supplies, while German artillery targeted their predictable patterns. The Navy designated these crews as support personnel rather than combat troops, a distinction that meant nothing to the 88mm shells that treated their ships as priority targets. Tyrone Jenkins had grown up in South Philadelphia, where his father worked night shifts at the Navy Yard welding Liberty ships. He joined the Navy in 1942 at age 19, drawn by recruitment posters promising technical training unavailable to black men in civilian life, only to discover the Navy's idea of opportunity meant assignment to the steward's branch serving white officers, or if they demonstrated exceptional competence, assignment to beach battalions facing the highest casualty rates. His commanding officer in Virginia had been direct during their final briefing, explaining the Navy needed men who could operate landing craft under fire without panicking, and that Negro crews tested well in combat simulations, though any failure would reflect on the entire race rather than individual sailors. The crew of Landing Craft Tank 427 consisted of 12 men from 6 states who had never met before amphibious warfare training in spring 1943. Raymond Price from Detroit served as mechanic, keeping twin diesel engines running despite saltwater corrosion and heavy seas. Eugene Washington from rural Georgia possessed uncanny ability to read ocean currents and coastal terrain, making him invaluable as coxswain. Walter Harris manned the bow ramp. Leon Foster and Arthur Coleman operated deck-mounted .50 caliber machine guns, and 7 others handled duties from radio to medical, though actual combat duties would be whatever task needed doing, regardless of training. Their training had been brutal, designed to prepare them for every scenario that might kill them. They practiced beach landings in darkness, learned to operate with battle damage, trained to fight fires in cargo holds, storing gasoline and ammunition, knowing a single spark would vaporize the entire boat. The most disturbing drills involved casualty evacuation, loading weighted dummies representing wounded soldiers, emphasizing that crews would continue operations even while their decks ran with blood. The briefing for Operation Neptune took place in a sealed warehouse in southern England during late May. Officers revealed that Utah Beach would be assaulted by the 4th Infantry Division starting at 06:30 on June 6th, with primary objective of capturing causeways leading inland across flooded fields. Landing Craft Tank 427 would be part of the second wave, hitting the beach approximately 45 minutes after initial assault to deliver combat engineers and explosives needed to clear obstacles. Intelligence indicated Utah defenses were relatively light compared to Omaha Beach, though reconnaissance suggested Germans had reinforced the area with additional troops and artillery positioned inland. 427 left Portsmouth Harbor at 2200 hours on June 5th as part of a massive convoy stretching across miles of ocean. The Channel crossing took 7 hours through rough seas, leaving half the soldiers violently seasick. Tyrone stood watch beside Eugene, scanning for German patrol boats or aircraft while maintaining convoy formation. The Navy imposed strict radio silence, meaning if their boat developed problems, they would solve them without support. As dawn broke over the French coast, revealing the dark shoreline ahead, Tyrone could see the bombardment fleet of battleships and cruisers opening fire on beach defences, shells screaming overhead toward targets Germans had fortified over 4 years. The first wave hit Utah Beach at 06:30, exactly as planned. Tyrone watched through binoculars as landing craft reached shore. Ramps dropped, infantry poured out. Then chaos. German machine guns opened up. Artillery shells fell. Water erupted in massive geysers. Several landing craft took direct hits, burning, sinking, men screaming. The radio crackled with desperate calls. 427 was going in. Eugene pushed throttles forward as they broke from holding area and began their run toward the beach. The boats surged through swells, crashing over the bow, where Walter stood ready at ramp controls, soaked with spray. Tyrone could see the beach clearly now, maybe 800 yards ahead. Covered with obstacles Germans had planted to rip open landing craft hulls. The Air Force promised to clear these obstacles, but they were still there. Hundreds of them, creating a deadly maze that coxswains had to navigate while under fire. At 400 yards, German artillery found their range. The first shell hit 50 feet to port, drenching the entire crew. Eugene veered starboard, nearly hitting a submerged obstacle before correcting course. The second shell was closer, maybe 30 feet, close enough that the shockwave rattled every rivet and caused engineers in the cargo hold to start praying out loud. Leon opened up with the bow 50 caliber, not at any specific target, but just to give the men psychological comfort of shooting back. German machine guns joined in at 200 yards. Bullets sparked off the steel ramp, shattered the pilot house glass. Raymond Price went down, blood spreading across the deck, not dead but hit bad. Tyrone grabbed the medical kit, pressure bandage, stop the bleeding, keep him breathing. Eugene kept driving forward. 100 yards, obstacle ahead. Eugene threw the wheel hard. The hull scraped metal, held together. 50 yards, the beach visible. Bodies everywhere, some moving, most not. Burning vehicles, destroyed landing craft. This was supposed to be the easy beach. Walter dropped the ramp the instant the bow ground into sand. Combat engineers charged out into waist-deep water, weighted down with explosives. German fire concentrated on them immediately. Men fell, kept going, or didn't. Tyrone couldn't watch, had to get Raymond below. The boat shuddered, taking hits, multiple hits, Leon still firing. Eugene, already reversing engines, had to get off this beach, had to go back, get more troops, more supplies, do it again. This was just the first run. They had orders for 12 more trips before sunset. The engines screamed as Eugene backed them off, propellers fighting for purchase while bullets hammered the hull. Arthur abandoned his gun to help Tyrone drag Raymond into the cargo hold, where the mechanic's blood mixed with seawater sloshing from dozens of holes punched through the hull. Raymond was conscious but going into shock, breathing rapid and shallow, skin cold and clammy. Tyrone knew from medical training that Raymond needed a surgeon within the hour or he would die, regardless of how well they controlled the bleeding. Eugene got them clear of the beach and pointed toward the transport area 6 miles offshore, where hospital ships waited, but the radio crackled with new orders before they could complete the run. Command wanted all available landing craft to immediately return with priority cargo. Infantry ashore needed ammunition and anti-tank weapons desperately, because German armor had been spotted moving toward the beachhead. Eugene looked at Tyrone, then at Raymond bleeding in the cargo hold, and both understood without speaking that they had a choice determining whether their mechanic lived or died, whether they followed orders and condemned their crewmate or violated direct commands during combat operations and faced court-martial charges that could result in decades in military prison. Walter made the decision by climbing down and taking over engine controls from Raymond, his hands moving across unfamiliar levers with surprising confidence. Eugene acknowledged the order and swung the boat back toward shore. Tyrone returned to Raymond's side with morphine and sulfur powder, and the knowledge that they were about to make 11 more runs into hell before this day ended. Assuming they survived long enough to complete even one more trip, assuming German artillery didn't find them on the next approach, assuming the damaged hull held together under the strain of repeated beachings and constant pounding of heavy seas and additional weight of whatever cargo they loaded for the return trip. Landing craft Tank 4, 27, completed 9 more runs to Utah Beach before sunset on June 6th, each trip delivering troops or supplies while evacuating wounded men whose blood permanently stained the deck plates. Raymond Price survived through morphine and Walter Harris's unexpected ability to maintain the diesel engines despite no formal training, though everyone knew their friend needed proper surgery that was impossible aboard a landing craft, spending 18 hours shuttling between transport ships and a beach where German artillery never stopped falling. The crew had been awake for 36 hours straight when they finally received orders to stand down for a 4-hour rest period, and Tyrone discovered his hands shaking so badly from exhaustion that he couldn't hold a cup of coffee without spilling it. The second day brought new orders reflecting how quickly the tactical situation evolved as Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches. 427 was reassigned from troop transport to ammunition resupply, loading their cargo hold with rifle ammunition, mortar rounds, artillery shells, and explosives needed by infantry advancing toward Sainte-Mère-Église, 8 miles inland. The Navy had established temporary supply dumps on the beach, where stevedore battalions, also composed entirely of black sailors, performed back-breaking labor unloading cargo ships under fire while organizing the constant flow of materials that modern warfare consumed at incomprehensible rates. The run to the beach on June 7th was less chaotic than Invasion Day, but no less dangerous because German artillery observers now knew exactly where to aim their guns. Eugene executed evasive maneuvers that saved them from a direct hit that would have detonated the ammunition in their cargo hold. They grounded on beach sections, partially cleared of obstacles, though destroyed vehicles and burned-out landing craft testified to yesterday's fighting intensity. A combat engineer squad immediately began unloading ammunition while warning that German snipers were active in the dunes and everyone should keep their heads down. What happened next fundamentally altered how Tyrone Jenkins understood his place in the world. The engineering squad unloading their ammunition consisted of 8 white soldiers who worked with professional efficiency while largely ignoring the black landing craft crew beyond minimum necessary communication, standard practice that Tyrone had long since accepted as how the military operated. But when unloading was nearly complete, a young private from Iowa, who couldn't have been more than 19, walked directly to Tyrone, extended his hand, and said loud enough for his entire squad to hear that he wanted to personally thank the landing craft crews who kept coming back yesterday, even when it looked like the invasion might fail, because without those deliveries, everyone on Utah Beach would probably be dead or captured. The private squad sergeant immediately intervened and pulled the young soldier away, while apologizing to Tyrone in a tone suggesting the apology was for the private's behavior rather than any offense, explaining the kid was still shaken up and didn't understand proper protocols regarding interaction between different units. The sergeant's meaning was clear without explicitly referencing race. The white soldiers quickly finished and moved away, as though prolonged proximity might contaminate them. Tyrone said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse, and Eugene was already reversing engines before the next artillery barrage arrived. They made 6 more supply runs over the next 2 days, as Allied forces expanded the beachhead, each trip following the same pattern of loading cargo, running to the beach, unloading under sporadic fire and returning for the next load. The work became routine and exhausting and dangerous in ways that felt worse because everyone knew it was only a matter of time before their luck ran out. Raymond Price was evacuated to a hospital ship on June 7th, leaving them short-handed with no replacement mechanics willing to serve on a landing craft crewed by black sailors. On June 9th, 427 received orders that deviated from their established pattern. They were to proceed to a small harbor facility 2 miles west of Utah Beach to pick up a French liaison officer and free French soldiers needing transport to a recently liberated village. The orders specified this was a priority diplomatic mission requiring clean uniforms and presentable appearance for interaction with Allied personnel evaluating American military professionalism. Eugene read the orders twice, then looked at Tyrone with an expression conveying what they both thought. The Navy had deliberately chosen a black crew because French officers would care less about racial composition than white American officers would. The French soldiers waiting at the partially destroyed pier were men who had escaped France after the 1940 defeat and spent 4 years training in Britain for liberation. Their officer, Captain Dubois, greeted the landing craft crew with warmth Tyrone found disorienting because white officers generally treated black, enlisted men with distant formality or open contempt. Dubois shook hands with everyone, asked their names and American hometowns, and expressed genuine admiration for landing craft crews who made the invasion possible by delivering supplies under impossible conditions. The village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont lay 3 miles inland along narrow roads through hedgerow country where fighting had been particularly intense. Dubois explained the village had been liberated on June 6th by paratroopers who dropped inland during the night, and French civilians who endured 4 years of German occupation were eager to welcome their American liberators, with celebrations planned for years. What Dubois didn't mention was that villagers expected white American soldiers based on newsreels, and black Americans would challenge assumptions about racial hierarchies. Sainte-Marie-du-Mont appeared around a bend, stone buildings, church steeple, tricolour flags everywhere, people gathering in the square, dozens, maybe hundreds, women, children, old men, some young resistance fighters. They were cheering, running toward the landing craft. Dubois stood up, waved, the crowd went wild. Then they saw the crew, black faces in American uniforms. For exactly 3 seconds everything stopped. Silence, confusion. Then a woman screamed, not fear, joy, pure joy. She broke from the crowd running with arms outstretched. She reached Tyrone first, grabbed his face, kissed both cheeks, tears streaming, speaking rapid French, Dubois translated. She was thanking him for ending the nightmare, for bringing freedom, for being heroes who crossed an ocean to save strangers. More people surged forward, shaking hands, offering wine, bread, flowers, touching uniforms like they couldn't believe Americans were real. An elderly man pushed through wearing a faded French army uniform from the Great War, ribbons on his chest. He walked straight to Eugene. The old soldier saluted. Eugene returned it. The Frenchman spoke halting English, said he fought alongside American Negro troops in 1918, the 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters. Finest soldiers he ever saw, treated like men in France, treated like heroes, never understood why America didn't see what France saw. Eugene had no answer. The old soldier embraced him, held on, would not let go. The celebration lasted 4 hours, where tables had been set up with food and wine villagers had hidden from Germans specifically for this liberation moment. Tyrone and his crew found themselves surrounded by French civilians wanting to shake hands, practice English, ask about America, express overwhelming gratitude. Children climbed on Walter Harris, asking him to lift them. Young women kissed Arthur and Leon and draped flowers around their necks. The village mayor made a formal speech declaring the Americans who liberated Sainte-Marie-du-Mont were heroes who would be remembered forever, specifically mentioning landing craft crews who braved enemy fire. Dubois translated and added that the mayor made no distinction between black and white soldiers because in French eyes all liberators were equally heroic, regardless of race. and perhaps this was something America might learn from France. The celebration ended when military police arrived with 2 white army officers, who informed Dubois the landing craft was needed for immediate return, and the crew had been absent longer than mission parameters allowed. The officers didn't speak directly to Tyrone or any black sailors, addressing only Dubois as though the crew were invisible. The French captain responded with icy politeness, barely concealing his anger, and villagers shouted protests at the American officers. But orders were orders. The crew said goodbye to people who had treated them like human beings worthy of respect, then returned to their boat to resume the war. Eugene sat at the helm during the return trip, did not speak, did not look at anyone, just stared ahead. Tyrone sat beside him, also silent, both processing what happened in that square. 4 hours of being treated like heroes by people with every reason to be grateful. 4 hours of being seen as men who had done something worthy of honor. 4 hours of experiencing what life might be like where skin color mattered less than actions and courage. 4 hours that would have to sustain them through however many years until they returned to an America that would probably still consider them second-class citizens. The experience had been exhilarating and heartbreaking equally, and neither knew what to do with the knowledge that somewhere in the world there existed people who could look past race and see the human beings underneath, while their own country remained committed to segregation, denying their basic humanity. The briefing came down from Naval Command on June 12th, 6 days after the initial invasion, delivered by a lieutenant commander from Fleet Headquarters who gathered the crews of all black-operated landing craft at the temporary supply depot that had been established on Utah Beach. The officer was precise and formal in his delivery, reading from a document that he described as operational guidelines for interaction with French civilian populations, though the actual content of those guidelines made clear that this was not about operational security or tactical considerations, but rather about maintaining the racial hierarchies that governed American military and civilian society. The directive specified that Negro personnel should minimize contact with French civilians, should decline invitations to social gatherings in liberated villages, should not accept accommodations in private French homes, even when billeting space was limited, and should particularly avoid situations that might create the impression that black American servicemen held equivalent status to white American officers, or that the United States military operated on principles of racial equality rather than the segregated structure that reflected American social norms. Lieutenant Commander Harrison, the officer delivering this briefing, seemed uncomfortable with the assignment and made several attempts to frame the directive in terms of military discipline and unit cohesion rather than explicit racial policy, explaining that the Army and Navy leadership were concerned about maintaining good order and preventing incidents that might complicate relationships with French civilian authorities who did not fully understand American social customs. The black sailors listening to this briefing understood exactly what was being communicated, regardless of the euphemistic language the officer employed, and several crew members exchanged glances that conveyed their shared awareness that the military command structure was more concerned about French civilians treating black soldiers as equals than about the actual operational challenges of conducting amphibious warfare in contested territory. Tyrone listened to the entire briefing without expression, his face a mask that revealed nothing of his thoughts about being ordered to reject the hospitality and gratitude of people who had treated him with more dignity and respect in 4 hours than his own country had shown him in 21 years of life. The directive had been prompted by reports from military intelligence officers who had observed multiple instances of French civilians treating black American servicemen with what the reports described as inappropriate familiarity and excessive enthusiasm, creating situations that contradicted the established military policy of maintaining clear separation between white and Negro personnel in all aspects of military service, including off-duty activities and interaction with civilian populations. The intelligence reports specifically mentioned the village of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, where landing craft crews had been celebrated by French civilians in a manner that military observers found problematic because it failed to distinguish between the Negro sailors who had delivered supplies and the white paratroopers who had actually conducted the combat operations that liberated the village. One report filed by an Army major attached to the 101st Airborne Division noted with particular concern that French civilians had embraced black sailors, offered them wine and food, allowed their children to climb on Negro servicemen, and generally behaved as though racial distinctions that were fundamental to American military organization were irrelevant or non-existent, which the major argued could undermine discipline and create expectations among Negro troops that would become problematic when they returned to segregated facilities and duties after the war ended. These reports circulated through the command structure during the week following D-Day as senior officers grappled with the unexpected challenge of operating in a liberated country where the local population did not share American attitudes about race and actively rejected attempts to impose segregation policies on French soil. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, who was responsible for maintaining coalition unity among American, British, Canadian, and French forces, received multiple memoranda from subordinate officers requesting guidance on how to handle situations where French civilian authorities insisted on treating all American servicemen equally regardless of race, and where French military officers expressed confusion or disapproval when they learned about American segregation practices that assigned men to different units, different duties, different facilities, and different ranks based solely on skin color rather than ability or experience. Eisenhower's response, documented in files that would remain classified for decades after the war, was characteristically pragmatic and politically astute, directing his staff to emphasize that segregation was an internal American military matter that should not be imposed on Allied forces or civilian populations, while simultaneously instructing commanders to minimize situations that would expose the contradiction between American rhetoric about fighting for freedom and democracy and American practice of denying those same principles to millions of its own citizens. The practical implementation of this policy directive created immediate friction between American military police units responsible for enforcing segregation and French civilian authorities, who viewed such enforcement as an insult to French sovereignty and an attempt to export American racial problems to European soil. In the town of Carentan, liberated on June 12th after intense fighting that destroyed much of the town centre, the French mayor issued a formal proclamation declaring that all Allied soldiers, regardless of nationality or race, were welcome in the town's remaining cafes and public spaces, and that any attempt by American military police to enforce segregated facilities would be treated as a violation of French law and reported to General de Gaulle's provisional government in London. The mayor's proclamation was particularly pointed because Carentan had been liberated by both white and black American units working in coordination, with black quartermaster and transportation battalions delivering the ammunition and supplies that enabled white infantry companies to clear German defenders from the rubble-strewn streets. And French civilians had witnessed this cooperation and found the subsequent American attempts to segregate off-duty facilities to be both hypocritical and offensive. Similar conflicts erupted in villages throughout the liberated zone as French civilians discovered that the American military operated under racial policies that many French citizens found incomprehensible and morally repugnant. In Sainte-Mère-Église, the first town liberated on D-Day and a symbolic center of the liberation celebration, The town council voted unanimously to award certificates of honor to all American units that had participated in the liberation, specifically including the Black Landing Craft crews and stevedore battalions, whose contributions had been largely ignored in official American military communiques that credited only combat infantry units with liberating the town. When American military authorities attempted to prevent black servicemen from attending the public ceremony where these certificates would be presented, arguing that such attendance would violate segregation protocols and create inappropriate situations where Negro personnel would be publicly honored alongside white officers, the French mayor responded by threatening to cancel the entire ceremony and issue a public statement explaining that American racial policies had made it impossible to properly thank all of the liberators, which would have created a diplomatic incident that could damage Allied unity at a critical moment in the campaign. Captain Dubois, the Free French liaison officer who had witnessed the celebration in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, became increasingly vocal in his criticism of American segregation policies as he observed how those policies affected the black servicemen he had come to respect during his work coordinating supply operations between French and American forces. During a planning meeting on June 14th at the Naval Command Post, Dubois confronted an American colonel who had suggested that French civilian authorities should be educated about the reasons for American segregation practices, arguing that France had no interest in learning lessons about racial hierarchy from a country that claimed to be fighting for liberty while denying basic rights to millions of its own citizens based solely on their ancestry. The confrontation became heated when the American colonel suggested that Dubois did not understand the complexities of race relations in America, to which Dubois replied that he understood perfectly well that America was asking French soldiers and civilians to die fighting for freedoms that America itself refused to extend to all its people, and that this hypocrisy was not lost on anyone who bothered to think critically about what the war was actually supposed to achieve beyond defeating Germany and Japan. Landing craft Tank 427 continued its supply runs throughout this period of increasing tension between American segregation policies and French resistance to those policies, and Tyrone Jenkins found himself navigating a situation where his military duties increasingly conflicted with his personal experiences of being treated with dignity by French civilians, who seemed genuinely confused about why America would waste the talents and courage of men like him by relegating them to support roles and denying them opportunities for advancement or recognition. The crew received multiple warnings from naval officers about maintaining proper distance from French civilians and declining invitations to social events. Warnings that came with implied threats about disciplinary action or transfer to less desirable assignments if they failed to comply with the directives that command had issued regarding racial protocols. But the crew also received ongoing invitations from French families who wanted to host them for meals, from village officials who wanted to thank them for their service, from children who wanted to practice English and hear stories about America, from resistance fighters who wanted to share wine and compare experiences of fighting against German occupation. The breaking point came on June 16th, when military police attempted to physically prevent a group of black sailors, including Tyrone and Eugene, from entering a café in the town of Montebourg, where they had been invited by the French proprietor, who had publicly announced that his establishment welcomed all Allied servicemen without distinction of race or rank. The military police, a squad of 4 white soldiers led by a sergeant from Alabama, positioned themselves outside the cafe entrance and informed the black sailors that the establishment had been designated for white personnel only in accordance with military regulations that governed off-duty facilities, and that any attempt to enter would result in charges of insubordination and violation of direct orders. The French proprietor emerged from his cafe, assessed the situation, and then did something that would be documented in multiple military reports and would eventually contribute to policy changes that occurred too late to affect most black servicemen who served in Europe during World War II. The proprietor called for the mayor. The mayor arrived with 2 gendarmes. The mayor informed the military police that French law governed French establishments on French soil and that no foreign military force had the authority to impose segregation policies in violation of French sovereignty. The MPs insisted they were enforcing American military regulations. The mayor responded by declaring the entire cafe off-limits to all American military personnel until American command agreed to respect French law regarding equal access to public accommodations. The standoff attracted a crowd: French civilians, American soldiers, British troops passing through, everyone watching. The MP sergeant radioed for instructions. Higher command responded, ordered him to withdraw. The French had won. The black sailors entered the cafe. The proprietor served them wine, free of charge. The crowd outside applauded. The hypocrisy was visible to everyone. America had crossed an ocean to fight for freedom it refused to practice. Tyrone sat in that cafe, drank his wine, said nothing. Eugene beside him, Walter, Leon, Arthur, all of them silent, processing. They had risked their lives delivering troops and ammunition onto beaches where German artillery tried to kill them every day for 10 consecutive days. They had earned medals they would never receive, recognition they would never get, gratitude their own officers would never express, but French civilians saw them, acknowledged them, treated them as men who deserved respect. 4,000 miles from home, and it took liberation of a foreign country to experience basic human dignity. What did that say about America? About the country they were supposed to be fighting for? About what would happen when they went home and everything returned to the way it was before? They drank their wine. They knew the answer. Nothing would change. Except them. They had changed. They had seen what respect looked like, felt what equality meant, tasted freedom in a French cafe that American military police had tried to deny them. They could never go back to not knowing what they were missing. That knowledge would burn forever. Landing craft tank 427 operated in Normandy for 3 more months after the initial liberation, continuing supply runs that gradually shifted from combat support under fire to routine logistics as Allied forces pushed toward Paris and the German border. The crew witnessed Utah Beach transform from a killing ground to a massive supply depot, and they participated in dozens of ceremonies where French villages honored their American liberators, always including the black servicemen, despite American military efforts to maintain segregated recognition events. Tyrone Jenkins collected letters from French families, photographs with French children, and a medal from the mayor of Montebourg, who had defied American military police. Though he knew these mementos would mean nothing to the country he would return to when the war ended. Orders came in September 1944, directing the crew to report for Pacific Theater reassignment. They said goodbye to French civilians who had become friends, to Captain Dubois, who had defended their dignity, to the café proprietor who shared one final bottle of wine. The French farewells were emotional and genuine, contrasting sharply with perfunctory American Naval Command acknowledgement that made no mention of the conditions under which their missions had been completed or the courage required to repeatedly drive toward beaches where men died serving their country. The transport ship docked at Norfolk Naval Station in Virginia on October 3, 1944. Within his first hour on American soil, Tyrone discovered that the respect he experienced in France had been temporary. Base facilities were strictly segregated with separate barracks, mess halls, recreation areas, and drinking fountains for Negro personnel. White sailors who spent the war stateside walked past black combat veterans without acknowledgement, and military police enforced segregation boundaries with zealousness, suggesting Negro servicemen were threats requiring surveillance rather than veterans deserving gratitude. The crew scattered to their home cities during 2 weeks' leave before Pacific training. Tyrone returned to South Philadelphia, where his family lived in the same row house, and his father still worked night shifts at the Navy Yard. His father listened to stories about France with sad, knowing expression, having heard similar accounts from black veterans of the First World War who also experienced temporary equality in Europe, only to return to an America refusing to extend that equality beyond its borders. Eugene Washington returned to rural Georgia, where white civilians resented black veterans who had seen combat and experienced life beyond Jim Crow segregation. He was refused service at a diner where the proprietor said his uniform meant nothing. When Eugene attempted to vote in November, using his veteran status to claim franchise, local officials administered an impossible literacy test and denied his registration. The message was clear. His service earned him nothing except knowledge that America valued racial purity more than courage or sacrifice. Walter Harris, Leon Foster, Arthur Coleman and others had similar experiences in Detroit, Chicago, and New York, where black veterans discovered their military service was viewed as an anomaly or threat rather than evidence deserving equal treatment. Some found factory work that would gradually disappear as white veterans demanded priority. Others struggled with combat trauma the military neither acknowledged nor treated, because Navy psychiatric services operated under assumptions that black men were too primitive to experience psychological damage. Several dealt with trauma through alcohol or isolation, unable to reconcile the men they became in France with limited roles American society assigned them. The crew maintained contact through letters and occasional reunions, where they shared memories of France and reminded each other they had experienced something profound when French civilians treated them as heroes. Some became active in the emerging civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, using military service as moral authority to argue that men who risked lives defending freedom abroad deserved that same freedom at home, citing France as evidence that racial equality was possible in societies not built around maintaining white supremacy. Eugene participated in voter registration drives in Georgia and was beaten by police during a protest march in Albany. When white officials asked why he was causing trouble, he told them about French mayors who defied American military police to ensure black soldiers received equal honor. Tyrone Jenkins returned to France in 1984 for the 40th anniversary of D-Day with a small group of black veterans who scraped together money because they wanted to see villages where they had been treated as men. French villages had erected monuments and plaques specifically honoring black American units that participated in liberation, memorials naming individual landing craft crews and stevedore battalions whose contributions had been erased from American military histories focused on white combat units. The mayor of Montebourg, grandson of the man who defied military police in 1944, gave a speech explaining his grandfather insisted until death that the black American sailors who delivered supplies under fire were the bravest men he met during the war, and French gratitude would never diminish, regardless of how their own country chose to remember or forget their contributions. The recognition black veterans received in France during that anniversary stood in sharp contrast to treatment in America, where most communities did not acknowledge that black servicemen played significant roles in winning World War II, and where history textbooks and films depicted the war as fought and won exclusively by white soldiers. Few black veterans who attempted sharing their stories with younger generations encountered skepticism, because the dominant narrative had been so thoroughly whitewashed that Americans could not imagine black men had operated landing craft at Normandy, or that French civilians celebrated them as liberators. Some black veterans stopped telling their stories entirely, tired of being dismissed, and took their experiences to graves without ever receiving recognition that should have been their right. Tyrone Jenkins died in 2009 at age 86, having lived long enough to see America elect its first black president, but not long enough to see the full historical record of black military service become widely known or taught in schools. His obituary mentioned his military service in a single sentence, without details about his landing craft crew or missions at Utah Beach or months delivering supplies under fire while American command tried preventing French civilians from honoring him. His funeral was attended by 3 surviving crew members, including Eugene Washington, who was 92, and delivered a eulogy speaking about the day they were celebrated in a French village square, and how that single day of being treated as heroes sustained them through decades of being treated as less than full citizens in the country they risked their lives to defend. Today, 79 years after D-Day, villages throughout Normandy maintain memorials to black American servicemen who participated in liberation, plaques naming specific units and individuals honored by French communities as heroes who crossed an ocean to fight for freedom. Montebourg has a permanent museum exhibit dedicated to landing craft crews who delivered supplies during invasion, featuring photographs of Tyrone Jenkins and Eugene Washington and crewmates standing in the village square, surrounded by French civilians embracing them and offering wine and flowers. The exhibit includes a copy of the directive from American military command ordering Negro personnel to minimize contact with French civilians, displayed alongside photographs documenting how thoroughly French civilians rejected that directive and insisted on treating all liberators with equal respect. School children in Normandy learn about these black American sailors as part of their liberation education, and elderly French citizens who remember the war still speak with admiration about courage of men who kept coming back to beaches day after day. In the United States, most Americans have never heard these stories. The dominant World War II narrative remains focused on white heroes and white units, while contributions of black servicemen who faced enemy fire abroad and racial discrimination at home remain largely invisible in popular memory. History textbooks mention military segregation as a footnote without examining how it affected actual human beings who served with courage despite being denied recognition their service should have earned. The irony is profound and painful. French villages remember and honor black American liberators whose own country has mostly forgotten them, and the men who experienced brief equality in liberated France carried that knowledge as both gift and burden for the rest of their lives, knowing what America could be if it chose to live up to its stated principles rather than maintaining systems of hierarchy contradicting everything the country claims to represent.